Okay, let's pick up where we left off last time, and that was with the fourth of our four mind-body problems, which is this problem of behavior without mind. And the question there is, let's think about mind as consciousness for a second, and how much behavior can you engage in without really being conscious of what you're doing? And there are certainly some examples of mindless behavior in the psychological literature. We have, for example, a whole bunch of innate behaviors, innate stimulus-response connections built into us by our physiology, by evolution. Spinal and cranial reflexes like the patellar reflex or the eye blink reflex. Taxis that, say, invertebrates show when a moth moves towards a source of light, and various kinds of instincts like the zigzag dance of the stickleback fish and all of that. The general idea there is that those are all reflex-like behaviors that are executed without any kind of conscious awareness or conscious control at all. They are essentially involuntary behaviors. When we come to something more complicated and more interesting, even there, the argument, there's a traditional argument that classical and instrumental conditioning are also essentially reflex-like behaviors, so that when Pavlov's dog salivates to the sound of a bell, or Thorndike's cats escape from a cage, they're essentially just responding to the stimuli in the environment without engaging in anything like conscious thought. There is an argument an assertion by some philosophers and other cognitive scientists that all behavior, all human behavior, or the vast bulk of human behavior is of this character, reflex-like, if not exactly reflexive in nature, engaged in involuntarily and unconsciously. This is the argument about zombies, okay? And you've already been introduced, I think, in your reading in Rev and Swo, if not the Searle book, to this question about the zombies and their implications for various aspects of the mind-body problem. Now, there's a distinction that it's important to make here. There are several different kinds of zombies that occur in philosophical arguments. The one that gets the most attention is, I think, actually wrong-headed for reasons that I'll talk about in a second. But there are some philosophers who posit that there could be people, there could be organisms that are physiologically identical to humans, but who lack conscious experiences. And the argument goes something like this. I can imagine that there are creatures that are physiologically identical to humans, but who lack conscious experiences. If I can imagine a creature that is physiologically identical to humans, but can lack conscious experiences, then hardcore materialism leaves something out of the argument, because if you're physiologically identical to humans, you have to have conscious experiences, right? So people like David Chalmers, for example, say, I can imagine people who are physiologically identical but who lack conscious experience, and therefore materialism leaves something out. And if you think about this, I think for about 3.5 seconds, you notice that you cannot imagine somebody who is physiologically identical to humans, but who is not conscious. Because humans are conscious, okay? And we're conscious by virtue of our physiology. So if some creature is physiologically identical to us, it must perforce be conscious, okay? So let's just get the philosopher's zombie out of our minds immediately. And also, let's deal with another philosopher's argument against the philosopher's zombie. Dan Dennett, for example, postulates the creatures that he calls Zimbos, kind of the backwards zombie, okay? And a Zimbo is a zombie that believes it's conscious, okay? It isn't conscious, because zombies aren't conscious, but it believes that it is conscious. And the point of Dennett's argument really is that we're Zimbos, okay? Dennett basically doesn't think consciousness exists. He doesn't think consciousness plays any causal role in behavior, but he does think that we believe that we're conscious, even though we're not. So set that one aside for a second. We're going to come back to it at the end of these lectures, because this is an argument about human behavior that has captured quite a bit of attention and quite a bit of force lately. The zombies that are really interesting from the point of view of this course are what David Chalmers calls Hollywood zombies. Okay, these are the kinds of zombies that appear in George Romero movies. The kinds of zombies I've never seen Walking Dead. Anybody here seen Walking Dead? Okay, it ain't good. Oh, good. Okay, all right. Because I'd rather watch Modern Family myself. But in any event, if you think about what a Hollywood zombie is, the Hollywood zombie is really a very interesting creature from a philosophical perspective and from the perspective of cognitive science and psychology, because Hollywood zombies lack consciousness. That is their property. That is almost their defining property. Although if you look at the later George Romero movies, you see hints that maybe zombies could evolve consciousness. But in Night of the Living Dead, they're clearly unconscious. Okay, and these are the zombies that are actually inspired by the zombies of Haitian folklore and all of that, because they are held to be creatures who are undead, who are living but who lack souls. What's interesting about this is that it's very easy, I think, to imagine a behaving organism that lacks consciousness, okay? Because we've already had examples of that. We have reflex and taxis and instinct and classical and instrumental conditioning, all of which it's argued go on without outside of consciousness. But the question raised by Hollywood zombies is simply this: is there anything that a zombie can't do precisely because it lacks consciousness? Okay, so never mind that they're physiologically identical or behaviorally identical. That begs the question. Postulate a creature that lacks consciousness, and then ask yourself, is there anything that it can't do? There are some philosophers and other cognitive scientists who argue no. And the reason for that is that consciousness is irrelevant. These are people who endorse the philosophical position of epiphenomenalism, that argues that we have consciousness, but consciousness doesn't play any kind of causal role in behavior. We just behave, and consciousness kind of accompanies that behavior, or is some kind of afterthought. We're going to take this up a little bit later, but if you want to think about it this way, this is really the reverse of the traditional mind-body problem. When we ask about the neural correlates of consciousness, the question we're asking is, what's the difference physiologically between a creature that's conscious and a creature that's not conscious? Okay? What's the difference in the nervous system that makes for consciousness? The zombies reverse the question in an interesting way, because what the problem of zombies, and especially the Hollywood zombie, invites us to ponder is, what difference does consciousness make to behavior? Okay? Does it make any difference at all? If it doesn't, then epiphenomenalism is right. If it does, then epiphenomenalism is somewhat misguided. And just so you know, I'm not putting up a straw man here. Here's a famous quote from John Barge, who's a professor at Yale University, and Tanya Chartrand, who's now at University of North Carolina, who in fact argues that for almost all of our waking existence, we are essentially zombies in the Hollywood sense, because we are operating on the basis of automatic, unconscious processes. Most of a person's everyday life is determined not by their conscious intentions and deliberate choices, but by mental processes that are put into motion by features of the environment that operate outside of conscious awareness and guidance. In other words, we are, most of us, most of the time, zombies. All right? We are operating on the basis of automatic processes, and consciousness has nothing whatsoever to do with it. Quick question.
When they say most, do they specify what kind
Yeah, actually, Barge was asked that question once, and for those of you who have parents old enough to tell you about a famous Ivory soap commercial, Barge answered, I believe that behavior is 99 and 44/100% purely automatic. Okay? So if you want somebody to put a figure on it, he did, in print. Yeah? No, because that could simply be part of a stimulus response mechanism, okay? You get visual input from something, and then you do something, right? You're a stimulus response machine, okay? So no, it doesn't contradict. The fact that you can detect things in your environment doesn't show that you have consciousness, because, you know, the Mars rovers detect stuff in their environment, and nobody's saying that they're conscious. Right? Okay, so let's look at this. Let's broaden this out a little bit. In order to kind of address this question, we need to do something else, and that is the question about whether we're actually automatons. We need to look at the relations between consciousness and attention, which means we need to look at attention. Okay. Perhaps the most common psychological interpretation of consciousness is that it has something to do with attention. By virtue of attending to something, we bring that thing into conscious awareness. That's a general kind of folk psychological idea about attention. If you're a memory psychologist, you have a slightly different interpretation of this, which is that if you're conscious of something, that thing is represented in what William James called primary memory, or what psychologists these days typically call working memory, that short-term memory that holds all the things that you're aware of right now. Primary memory or working memory holds an object of attention in awareness while you perform some kind of work on it. So again, just not going to worry about the difference right now between attention and working memory or primary memory. But the general idea here is that attention is the pathway to primary memory. By virtue of paying attention, we become aware of something and hold a mental representation of that thing in our awareness, which leads to the question of what attention is anyway. In a famous essay in the Principles of Psychology, Chapter 11, James begins by saying everybody knows what attention is, right? Never mind that for the last 124 years we've been trying to figure out how attention works. James had it figured out. It's the taking of possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible trains of thought. James's idea here is that there's lots of stuff in the world, lots of stimuli impinging on our sensory surfaces, but we're not aware of all of this. We're only aware of a small segment of it, that part of the sensory field, that part of the environment to which we're paying attention at the time. And James went on to offer a kind of classification of different kinds of attention. For example,